Hello, students. Good day to all of you. This is Dr. BK for you, and today I am going to discuss about two topics, mainly the cavernous sinus as a continuation of the previous class, and followed by that I will be discussing about the pituitary gland also. Now, our learning objectives for today will be mainly on the cavernous sinus, that is its situation, extent, relations, tributaries, communications, and the clinical aspects. Now, in my previous class, I have discussed about the dural folds, the two layers of the cranial dura, that is the endosteal layer and the meningeal layer. Followed by that, the dural venous sinuses, we have classified them into paired and the unpaired dural venous sinuses. Where they are present, its tributaries and connections we have already discussed. As a continuation of that, today we are going to pay special attention to this cavernous sinus because of its wide communications, and also it has got immense clinical significance, and many important nerves, the cranial nerves, also are in intimate contact with this cavernous sinus. So that is why cavernous sinus actually gains special importance. Now, where actually the cavernous sinus is situated? It is situated in the middle cranial fossa. You are able to see the middle cranial fossa. This is the body of the sphenoid bone. On either side of the sphenoid bone, you see the cavernous sinus. So that means you have a right and left cavernous sinus. It is obviously a paired sinus. Now, why actually it has got the name cavernous sinus? Because in the cadavers, if you dissect the cadavers, inside the interior of the sinus is actually divided into numerous interconnecting spaces because of the reticular fibers present in it. So because of its interconnected spaces, it is cavernous in appearance. So that is why it is actually called as the cavernous sinus. But this type of arrangement cannot be seen in a living subjects. Only the periphery of the sinus we can see. It is actually divisible into cavernous spaces. So it is situated on the either side of the body of the sphenoid bone. So anteriorly, the anterior limit of the sinus will be the superior orbital fissure, which is present between your lesser wing. This is the posterior border of the lesser wing, and below the floor, the lateral part of the floor of the middle cranial fossa is formed by the greater wing. So between the lesser wing and greater wing, the superior orbital fissure is formed. That forms the anterior limit of the cavernous sinus. Posteriorly, it is limited by the apex of petrous temporal bone. So the apex, the petrous temporal bone, this is the apex part and this is the upper margin. It has got an anterior sloping surface and posterior sloping surface. This pointed tip medially is actually the apex of the petrous part of temporal bone, which forms the posterior limit of the cavernous sinus. So here you are able to see the attached margin of the the tentorium cerebelli. So this side you are able to see the tentorium cerebelli, and here the tentorium cerebelli has been cut open. So you are able to see the infratentorial compartment. Within the attached margin, you are able to see the superior petrosal sinus. Okay. And posterior attached margin of the tentorium, you are able to see the right and left transverse sinus. Then below the infratentorial part, you are able to see the sigmoid sinus, the transverse sinus continuing as the sigmoid sinus. This is the confluence of the sinus. The superior sagittal sinus will come and attach here. There is the posterior bulged part of the sinus, and this is your straight sinus. So all this we have discussed in detail in the previous class itself. So now coming back to the cavernous sinus, I told you the extension is from the superior orbital fissure to the apex of the petrous temporal bone. Now, how actually it is formed? So we know as a rule, all the dural venous sinuses are present between the endosteal layer and the meningeal layer of dura mater. So this is also is present between the endosteal layer and the meningeal layer of the dura mater. Now, the boundaries or the walls of the sinus, you are able to see this thin margin is the roof. So in this picture, you will be able to appreciate this thin roof, and this is the lateral wall. So the roof and the lateral wall is mainly formed by the meningeal layer of dura mater. Okay. Now, if you trace this roof dura mater, it is continuous with this dural sheet, that is nothing but your diaphragma sellae. Okay. So the diaphragma sellae. So medially the roof is actually continuous with the diaphragma sellae. It is again a meningeal fold of dura mater, which is pierced in center by the pituitary stalk. Okay. So as I told you, the roof and the lateral wall is mainly formed by the meningeal layer, whereas the medial wall and the floor, so the floor and the medial wall is formed by the endosteal layer of dura mater, the endosteal layer of the dura mater. So here you are able to see that is the thin roof, where the roof of the meningeal layer of the dura continuing as the lateral wall. Now the roof is actually pierced by two structures. Mainly in the posterior part, you can see this structure which is piercing the roof is the oculomotor nerve, and of course even the trochlear nerve pierces the roof. Now this happens where the attached border of the tentorium and the free border of the tentorium cross each other. So the attached border along the superior margin and apex of petrous temporal extending into the posterior clinoid process, whereas the free margin which forms the tentorial notch is attached to the anterior clinoid process. So the place where the attached and the free border is crossed, it is pierced by the oculomotor nerve. So oculomotor nerve pierces the roof, then continues on the lateral wall, same way trochlear nerve also. Anteriorly, one structure is piercing and then coming above, that is your internal carotid artery. Okay, the internal carotid artery which is seen within the sinus. Now what happens is medial to the anterior clinoid process. Sometimes it will be forming a foramen that is called as the carotidoclinoid foramen, through which the internal carotid artery actually pierces the roof of the cavernous sinus, and then what happens is it is going to enter the brain before dividing into terminal branches as the anterior cerebral artery and the middle cerebral artery. Now coming to we have actually just now discussed about the situation, extent and the formation of the sinus. Now coming to the relations of the sinus, external relations, especially on the lateral wall, what are all the structures you come across? This is a coronal section passing through the cavernous sinus, that is the middle cranial fossa and the sphenoid bone. So you can see very well, medially it is related to the pituitary gland, and within the body of the sphenoid bone you have large air filled spaces, which is the sphenoidal air sinus. Okay, so this is your sinus. It is a diagrammatic representation. It has a medial wall, then it has got a roof and a lateral wall. Okay, so the roof and lateral wall is formed by the meningeal layer, whereas the floor and the medial wall is actually formed by the endosteal layer. So this is the two layers of the dura. and interiorly it is actually divided into numerous interconnecting spaces. So medial relation, we have seen the pituitary gland and the sphenoidal air sinus. The next what we will see is the laterally it is related external relations, mainly uncus of the temporal lobe. So the temporal lobe, the uncus of the temporal lobe, which you are able to see here, it is like a hook shaped what do you call the part of the temporal lobe is somewhat hook shape and bent like, and that is actually called as the uncus of the temporal lobe. Then posteriorly and laterally you have the trigeminal ganglion. You are able to see. So the posterior and lateral part of the sinus, that is the trigeminal ganglion, which is giving rise to the three branches. That is the ophthalmic, maxillary and mandibular. So the trigeminal ganglion is related posterolaterally. Superomedially it is related to the optic chiasma. So above mainly it is related to the optic chiasma. Then it will also be related to the internal carotid artery. See here the internal carotid artery, which is actually traveling within the sinus, then turns upwards medial to the anterior clinoid process. Okay, so medial to the anterior clinoid process it turns upwards, thereby it is forming also a superior medial relation with the cavernous sinus. So that turning part is actually called as the carotid siphon. Okay, so superomedial is related to optic chiasma and the internal carotid artery forming the carotid siphon. So these are the external relations of the cavernous sinus, mainly medial and then the lateral relations, then posterolateral and superomedial relations. Below, naturally it is related to the floor, which is formed by the external to the dura you have the greater wing of sphenoid. So here you are able to see another schematic diagram which is showing the two layers of the dura mater. So that is the meningeal layer, because here you are able to see the brain substance. This is the brain substance with the uncus of temporal lobe, which is covered by the leptomeninges. So this is your meningeal layer of dura mater forming the roof and the lateral wall. Floor and the medial wall is formed by the endosteal layer. And these are the structures in the lateral wall of the sinus and within the sinus, which we are going to speak very shortly. This is the hypophyseal fossa lodging the pituitary gland, hypophysis cerebri, and above it superomedially we have seen the optic chiasma. So now coming to the relations on the lateral wall. So on the lateral wall of the sinus, which you are able to see here, it is mainly related to four nerves. So from superior to inferior, the first nerve you see here is the oculomotor nerve. I told you the oculomotor nerve pierces the roof where the attached and the free border of the tentorium crosses. Then afterwards, what happens is the oculomotor nerve runs in the lateral wall of the sinus. And then in the anterior part of the sinus, nearer to the anterior part, it divides into two divisions, upper and lower divisions, and enters the intermediate compartment of the superior orbital fissure. Immediately below that, one more nerve you are able to see, the fourth cranial nerve, that is the trochlear nerve. That nerve also follows the same course of the oculomotor nerve, but superior orbital fissure, it does not enter within the intermediate compartment within the tendinous ring of Zinn. Instead, it enters outside the tendinous ring of Zinn. So, a lateral view, here you are able to see this. So, lateral wall of the sinus, it is related to the oculomotor nerve, which you are able to see here, which divides into two divisions. Then you are able to see the trochlear nerve. Then you are able to see the ophthalmic nerve, maxillary nerve. Mandibular nerve, since it passes through the foramen oval, does not relate to the sinus. Okay, within the sinus you are able to see the internal carotid artery and the abducent nerve. Okay, so this part is the superior orbital fissure between the lesser wing and the greater wing. You have a tendinous ring formed by the tendon of Zinn. So outside the ring, what happens is the trochlear nerve passes. The oculomotor nerve passes and divides into two divisions. Ophthalmic nerve divides into lacrimal, frontal and nasociliary. Okay, lacrimal and frontal will go above the ring, but nasociliary will go between the two divisions of the oculomotor. So don't worry about these relations, because superior orbital fissure will be again dealt in detail in the orbit topic. Now just remember these details alone. On the lateral wall, it is related to the oculomotor, trochlear, and then the ophthalmic division, then the maxillary division which passes through the foramen rotundum. All these structures on the lateral wall are separated from the venous blood by the endothelium. Okay, they are actually separated only by the endothelium layer which is lining the sinus, inner to the dura. You have the endothelial lining that separates the venous blood from these structures which we have discussed on the lateral wall. So to summarize, it is the oculomotor nerve, trochlear nerve, ophthalmic division which divides the anterior part into lacrimal, frontal and nasociliary, and then the maxillary nerve passing through the foramen rotundum. So as I told you, they are all separated by the endothelial lining of the sinus. So next we will pass on. Okay, this is a schematic diagram again. So this diagram I included because so that you can reproduce this diagram. The sinus is actually shown as a cubicle. This is posterior, this is anterior. So posterolaterally the trigeminal ganglion is seen here. Along the lateral wall, the third nerve, fourth nerve, trochlear nerve. This is the musculotendinous ring. Within the ring you can see the two divisions of the oculomotor entering, whereas trochlear is outside the musculotendinous ring. This whole structure is the superior orbital fissure. Ophthalmic divides into lacrimal, frontal outside the ring, nasociliary within the ring between the two divisions of oculomotor. Okay, then of course this is your VB is your maxillary division which is passing through the foramen rotundum. This is your mandibular division which is not related to the sinus. Within the sinus you can see the internal carotid artery, and that makes a carotid sign, an S-shaped curve, and then it is going to enter the brain after piercing the dura. And this is your sixth nerve which is also related within the sinus along with the internal carotid artery. So structures on the lateral wall of the sinus we have seen, which is separated from the sinus only by the endothelial lining. But within the substance of the sinus, we come across two more structures. One is the internal carotid artery. So the internal carotid artery, from the carotid canal, it enters via the posterior part of foramen lacerum, and then it is actually present in the carotid sulcus, a groove on the lateral wall of the body of the sphenoid bone. So this part is actually within the sinus, and then in the anterior part of the sinus it turns above, making a S-shaped curve medial to the anterior clinoid process, and then it pierces the meninges and then dura, and then it is going to supply the brain structures. Okay, so within the sinus I told you it is lodged in the carotid sulcus on the body of the sphenoid bone. The next structure what you see is the abducent nerve. Okay, the next structure is the abducent nerve. The abducent nerve is actually present superolateral to the internal carotid artery. Okay, the abducent nerve is actually present superolateral to the internal carotid artery. Okay, so the next structure which we are going to discuss is the tributaries of the cavernous sinus. So with respect to the tributaries of the cavernous sinus, superior ophthalmic vein is a tributary which drains into the cavernous sinus. Then a branch from the inferior ophthalmic vein also drains into the cavernous sinus. Superior ophthalmic vein, a branch from inferior ophthalmic vein, superficial middle cerebral veins, central vein of retina. So central artery of retina you have within the optic nerve. You also have central vein of retina. Not always, occasionally drains into the cavernous sinus. Then few inferior cerebral veins, and then sphenoparietal sinus, and also occasionally frontal division of middle meningeal vein or anterior trunk. Frontal division is also called as anterior trunk of middle meningeal vein. So orbital veins, we have seen superior and inferior ophthalmic veins as I told you. And this is the sphenoparietal sinus which is going to drain here. Then superficial middle cerebral veins and some inferior cerebral veins also drain, and middle meningeal vein frontal trunk, sometimes you see here it is draining into the cavernous sinus. So these are the tributaries: superior ophthalmic, branch from inferior ophthalmic, central vein of retina, occasional sphenoparietal sinus, superficial middle cerebral veins, certain inferior cerebral veins. So veins seen on the inferior surface of the cerebrum, and then occasionally the anterior division of middle meningeal vein. So next we will pass on to very important part of the cavernous sinus, that is the communications of the cavernous sinus. With respect to the communications, that is the connections which the cavernous sinus which maintains with the other venous sinuses or the veins. So mainly its connection with, first, very simple to start with, it actually communicates with the opposite cavernous sinus through anterior and posterior intercavernous sinus. Okay, so through anterior and posterior intercavernous sinus, it communicates with the opposite cavernous sinus. Then facial vein you are able to see here. So this is the course of the facial vein. The facial vein through the superior ophthalmic vein, it communicates with the cavernous sinus. This is one route. Other route is, one of the tributary of the facial vein is the deep facial vein, which has a communication with the pterygoid plexus of veins, through which it communicates with the cavernous sinus. So facial vein communicates with the cavernous sinus through two routes. One is through the superior ophthalmic vein, and other one is through the deep facial vein, pterygoid venous plexus. Then what are all the other communications? Superior petrosal sinus to the transverse sinus. So communication between the cavernous sinus and the transverse sinus through superior petrosal sinus. Then through internal jugular vein via the inferior petrosal sinus, one, and other one is the plexus around the internal carotid artery. These two also communicate with the internal jugular vein. Okay, so through the inferior petrosal sinus to internal jugular vein, and also plexus around the internal carotid artery maintains a connection between the cavernous and the internal jugular vein. Okay, then superior sagittal sinus via superficial middle cerebral vein and superior anastomotic vein. So this is called the superior anastomotic vein of Trolad. This we have already discussed in the superior sagittal sinus. Communication between the superior sagittal sinus and cavernous sinus is through superior anastomotic vein of the Trolad. Then it maintains connection with the pterygoid venous plexus through the emissary veins passing between the foramen ovale, spinosum and lacerum. These all transmits the emissary veins through pterygoid venous plexus, because the main function of the emissary vein is to connect the extracranial veins with the intracranial dural venous sinuses, mainly for the maintenance of intracranial pressure. They see to that the intracranial pressure does not increase. But what happens is they also serve as potential route for transmission of the infection. So, coming to the clinical aspects, thrombosis of the cavernous sinus, septic thrombosis. So, occlusion mainly due to infections. When these get occluded, from where does it might get infected? What are the routes of the transmission of infection? Mainly from the dangerous area of face. You know, the dangerous area of face is the nose, lower part of nose and the upper lip, because the facial vein has communications with the cavernous sinus. So, from dangerous area of face, then from the orbit, okay, so superior, inferior ophthalmic veins. So, naturally from the orbit, what happens is, it can also, infections can spread. Then from paranasal sinuses and from the pharynx. So, again, from the there are emissary veins which are actually connecting through the intracranial veins. Through this, from the paranasal sinus and pharynx, it can spread. Then, most commonly affected because of this is cavernous sinus. So, that is why it gains much clinical significance with respect to the other sinuses. Okay, so cavernous sinus is the most commonly affected sinus. Now, what are the clinical manifestations or symptoms? Mainly you come across pain around the eye and the forehead. This is because on the lateral wall of the sinus, ophthalmic division. So, naturally, pain distribution along these nerves, lacrimal, frontal and nasociliary nerves. So, pain around the forehead and the eye is one of the manifestations. Then second one is ophthalmoplegia. So, paralysis of the extraocular muscles, because third, fourth and sixth nerves are all involved. Third and fourth nerve on the lateral wall, abducen nerve which is within the sinus itself, inferolateral to the internal carotid artery. So, that is one of the reason. Okay. Then, so pain around the eye and forehead, ophthalmoplegia, edema of the eyelids. So, eyelids gets swollen. This is one reason, because again, venous drainage. Because the veins cannot drain, the sinus is blocked. So, naturally, all the veins draining the orbit also gets dilated and engorged. So, edema of the eyelids is actually seen. Then, due to the intercavernous sinus, so it can become bilateral. Infections from one sinus can actually spread to the other sinus. Now, the next serious condition is, in fractures of the skull, if the dura is torn and inside the cavernous sinus, if the internal carotid artery ruptures, rupture of internal carotid artery takes place in fractures of the skull, then the arterial blood and the venous blood will mix, forming a connection called as arteriovenous fistula. Okay, so arteriovenous fistula takes place within the cavernous sinus, which is a bit serious complication. So, because of that, what happens? You can see part of arterial blood is actually flowing into this and leads to pulsating exophthalmos. Your eyeball pulsates with respect to the, because of the pulsations of the artery are transmitted to these veins. So, it leads to pulsations, pulsating exophthalmos. Okay, then you come across, so you are able to see this eyeball is almost bulged when compared to the other normal eye. So, eyeball protrudes and pulsates. Then ophthalmoplegia, again you come across ophthalmoplegia because the nerves are again damaged in the lateral wall, paralysis of the muscles of the eyeball. Then again edema of the eyelids due to retrograde flow, reverse flow of blood. So, instead of blood draining into the cavernous sinus, because of the pulsations, the current flow, what happens is the flow of the blood is in the reverse order. So, that is one of the things why you see an edema around the eyelids and you hear a loud systolic murmur over the temporal region. Okay. So factors mainly not because of this arteriovenous fistula. Normally factors which aid in draining the cavernous sinus is by the arterial pulsations, internal carotid artery. That is one reason. Second thing is postural changes. So when we actually tilt our head when we lie down and then we get up, all these aid in venous return of cavernous sinus, and also gravity to some extent aid in venous drainage of the this sinus, that is the cavernous sinus. So we have completed with the cavernous sinus. Now we are passing to the next topic, that is the hypophysis cerebri or the pituitary gland. So it is situated in the hypophyseal fossa on the sella turcica. So the sella turcica, upper surface of body of sphenoid bone, which extends from the tuberculum sellae to the dorsum sellae, and the depressed part in the center is actually the hypophyseal fossa, which is limited by tuberculum sellae in the front and the dorsum sellae behind. So the gland is a neuroglandular structure because all the glands, they are made up of cells. You have a lot of fenestrated capillaries, blood sinusoids, but here apart from that you also have nerve fibers. So that is one peculiarity of the pituitary gland. Then it was considered as the master gland of the whole body because it releases the hormones necessary for the other endocrine glands. Okay, like your TSH, ACTH, adenocorticotrophic hormones, thyrotrophic hormones, and your follicle stimulating hormones, luteinizing hormone, and all those things. But now it has been proved that this pituitary itself is under the control of the hypothalamus, and even pineal gland, which is thought to have a control over the pituitary itself. So nowadays this term is not very frequently used as the master gland of the whole body, but it regulates the secretions of your thyroid, adrenal, testis, and the ovary. So as I told you, it is situated in the hypophyseal fossa on the upper surface of the body of the sphenoid. So the roof is actually covered by the diaphragma sellae. So here you are able to see the diaphragma sellae, which is formed by the meningeal layer of the dura mater, which is bridging the roof, and that is continuous with the roof of the cavernous sinus. So here you are able to see a very closer view of the roof of the cavernous sinus, and here the internal carotid artery which is piercing it. The center of the roof, you have an opening for the pituitary stalk. The roof is actually pierced by a pituitary stalk, infundibulum, or the pituitary stalk. Okay, so that is the situation. Now the covering, the capsule, any gland definitely has a capsule, is very intimately related to the meninges. So because of that, the CSF does not extend, and it is not present around the pituitary gland. So CSF, cerebrospinal fluid, does not extend because the meninges is very intimately related to the covering or the capsule of the pituitary gland. So now coming to the parts, the presenting parts of the pituitary gland. Basically the parts of the pituitary gland can be divided into an anterior lobe and a posterior lobe. The anterior lobe is called as the adenohypophysis, and the posterior lobe is actually called as the neurohypophysis because it mainly contains the unmyelinated axons. Neurohypophysis. So that is why it is termed as the neurohypophysis. Now let us get into more details about this adenohypophysis or the anterior lobe. So it consists of, first, between these two you see an intraglandular cleft. Intraglandular cleft you see here. Behind the cleft, this small area is the pars intermedia, which is the remnant of Rathke's pouch. So this Rathke's pouch is not very well developed in humans. In front of the intraglandular cleft, what you see is the pars anterior, which consists of the pars distalis. or the adenohypophysis. So adenohypophysis mainly consists of the pars distalis and of course some part extending into the pituitary stalk as the pars tuberalis and then the pars intermedia. Okay, it is actually intermediate between the anterior and the posterior part. Now if you look at the cells of the pars anterior, so that is your pars nervosa with unmyelinated axons, and here you are able to see this is the pars intermedia made up of lot of epithelial cells, and within that you see reticular fibers with sinusoids and fenestrated capillaries. So capillaries with pores are actually called as the fenestrated capillaries. Here two types of cells you come across, mainly chromophils and chromophobes. Okay, so they are actually called as the chromophils and the chromophobes. Chromophobe means phobia or fear, they don't take up the stain, whereas the darkly stained ones are actually called as the chromophils. They are again divided into acidophils and the basophils. Okay, chromophils are again divided into acidophils and the basophils. Chromophobes are thought to be the reserve cells, precursor cells. When needed, they can actually get transformed into the chromophobes. Okay, so chromophils and chromophobes. Chromophils are again divided into acidophils and the basophils based on their nature of the stain they take. Acidophils intensely stain with eosin and acid fusin, whereas basophils mainly take up basic stains like methylene blue. So intraglandular cleft, as I told you, is the remnant of the Rathke's pouch, and the pars intermedia is behind the cleft. Now coming to the pars anterior is pars tuberalis. A part of the pars anterior actually extends and actually it invests the pituitary stalk, and that is called as the pars tuberalis. Posterior lobe is the downward extension of the diencephalon. Anterior and posterior lobe both are different in their development, both are different in their function also. So neurons, unmyelinated axons, not the neurons, the nerve process axons, they actually extend from the hypothalamus, mainly from the two nucleus of the hypothalamus, that is the supraventricular nucleus and the paraoptic nucleus. From the paraventricular nucleus and supraoptic nucleus, from these two the axons they travel, and then what happens, they end as the expanded bulb-like structures which are called as the herring bodies. So these herring bodies are the place where the neurotransmitters, or the you can call it their secretions, the hormones are stored as secretory vesicles. So mainly unmyelinated axons and their ends form the herring bodies where the hormones or the secretions are stored, and in between this you see supporting cells, and they are called as the pituicytes. Okay, so between these axons you have supporting cells or the pituicytes. Okay, glial cells, they are actually the neuroglial cells which are called as the pituicytes. So here you are able to see the downward extension of the diencephalon, and this is actually called as the tuber cinereum. So relations of the pituitary gland: above it is covered the covering, that is the diaphragma cellule which I have already seen, then the optic chiasma and the floor of the third ventricle. Inferiorly, body of sphenoid with the sphenoidal air sinuses. So inferiorly you see the body of sphenoidal air sinuses. These are separated from the pituitary gland only by a thin bar of bone. Anteriorly, anterior intercavernous sinus you come across, and posterior intercavernous sinus behind, and on either side cavernous sinus with the structures on the lateral wall and also present within it. So they all form the lateral relations on either side. So these are the relations of the pituitary gland. So here you are able to see the pituitary gland, and the downward extension you are able to see the pituitary stalk. Okay, So that is your tuber cinereum, and this will be your mammillary body. So all these, they form the floor of the third ventricle. Third ventricle is actually only a single midline. On either side it is present. It is actually a midline structure. Third ventricle, it is a cavity of the diencephalon. So it is a space between the thalamus hypothalamus of one side and the other side. Okay. So the extension, this is actually the floor of the diencephalon, which is mainly formed by the pituitary stalk, tuber cinereum, infundibulum, mammillary body. Coming to the blood supply of the pituitary gland, it is mainly supplied by superior and inferior hypophyseal arteries. Superior hypophyseal artery is a branch of ophthalmic artery. Inferior hypophyseal artery is also a branch, direct branch from the internal carotid artery. Okay, sorry, superior hypophyseal artery is a branch of the internal carotid, not the ophthalmic. Now, coming to the hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system. So, portal system, do you remember the portal system which we have already discussed in the abdomen, in the portal vein? Portosystemic anastomos. So, portal system, when the term itself, what should come to our mind is it presents two sets of capillaries. So, when you have two sets of capillaries, it is called as a portal system. So, mainly the arteries branches from the superior hypophyseal artery. Along the pars tuberalis, they break up into tufts of capillaries. So from these tufts of capillaries, long and short portal vessels are formed. Okay, so long and intermediate or short portal vessels, they are formed, and they, what happens is, form the sinusoidal plexus in the adenohypophysis. Finally, they drain into the cavernous sinus. Okay, so one set of capillaries, and then you have the other set of capillaries. Now, next, what happens is, posterior part is actually supplied by the inferior hypophyseal artery, breaks into capillaries and drains separately into the cavernous sinus. Now, there are also portal vessels, short portal vessels, which are connecting the sinusoidal capillaries with this plexus of the inferior hypophyseal artery. Thereby, there is a communication. That is one thing. Now, the first tuft of capillaries, they are in intimate connection with the neurons. So, thereby, what happens is, these neurons release their secretions into these capillaries. Thereby, what happens is, it controls the activity of the pituitary gland. These neurons, via this hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system. Okay, so it actually releases the releasing hormones for this adenohypophysis. So that is about the blood supply. So coming to the development, adenohypophysis is developed from the stomodium, or the roof of the mouth. So this is your future mouth, and this should be your forehead region, and deep to the ectoderm you are able to see, that is the developing brain, which is also a part of ectoderm, the neuroectoderm. So from the roof of the mouth, a pouch will go above, and that is actually called as the Rothke's pouch, which forms the adenohypophysis. A downward prolongation from the diencephalon forms the posterior lobe. Now, this anterior pouch, it slowly detaches from the roof and it passes above. Sometimes you can see a craniopharyngeal canal on the posterior border of the posterior part of the nasal cavity, craniopharyngeal canal. And along its course, sometimes you come across pharyngeal hypophysis. That is adenohypophysis tissue. You can see that on the roof of the pharynx, because sometimes what happens, some of the tissues might get entrapped there on the roof of the pharynx because on the path of its ascent. Okay, so then what happens is, this forms your pars distalis and pars tuberalis. The downward growth is actually called as the from the diencephalon. Now, this lower part of this detaches from the roof of the mouth and completely disappears. Okay, so downward growth of diencephalon is the posterior lobe or the neurohypophysis. Adenohypophysis is from the Rathke's pouch. So coming to the clinical aspects, so tumors of the pituitary gland, rare tumors called as the craniopharyngioma, they might put pressure on the surrounding structures. One is the dura mater can get stretched, so you might get pain. Then immediately above what you see is the optic chiasma. Pressure over the optic chiasma can lead to bitemporal hemianopia, because bitemporal hemianopia is what happens is partial blindness. That is, the lateral field of the vision is affected because it actually compresses over the optic chiasma. Then it can put pressure over the third ventricle and thereby can lead to increased intracranial pressure. So CSF is not drained properly. So that is one of the reason. Then ophthalmoplegia, paralysis of the muscles of the eyeball, because third, fourth and sixth nerve all might get involved if the tumor is going to bulge laterally and put pressure on the cavernous sinus. Sometimes simply a thin bar of bone, so any pressure on the sphenoidal sinus might also lead to nasal discharge. It is actually characterized by the presence of nasal discharge, and in the beginning itself I told you headache due to the stretching of the dura mater. So hormones is more of a physiology, so I will just give a quick account of the hormones. Adenohypophysis mainly secretes somatotrophs and mammotrophes. So acidophil secretes the growth hormone, mainly responsible for the growth of the epiphyseal plate of cartilage, growth hormones. Okay, so for the growth of the bones. Prolactin is mainly for the development, especially during pregnancy, the mammary gland. Basophils mainly secrete thyrotrophs, thyroid stimulating hormone, and actually it stimulates the thyroid gland to synthesize T3 and T4. So gonadotrophs, follicle stimulating hormone in case of the ovaries, and luteinizing hormone also in case of males, interstitial cell stimulating hormones. So mainly it stimulates the Leydig cells to actually synthesize the testosterone, and of course follicle stimulating hormone is also needed by the testis for the spermatogenesis in males. Then adenocorticotrophic hormones. So mainly it has an action over the adrenal gland, zona fasciculata and zona reticularis, to mainly produce its hormones. And then melanocyte stimulating hormone. So this is mainly for actually production of melanin, the skin pigment. So posterior lobe does not synthesize any hormone, only it is storing the hormone secreted from the hypothalamus, mainly your vasopressin or antidiuretic hormone, which actually enables the kidney to absorb the excess water and makes the urine concentrate. Then oxytocin mainly acts on the smooth muscle of the uterus during labor, and also to in case of the suckling reflex of the baby. So these are a brief account of the hormones of the pituitary gland. So we will also have a quick review of the trigeminal ganglion also, because within the cranial cavity, let us not leave any other structure unexplained. So it is also called as the Gazerian ganglion, situated in the fossa for the trigeminal ganglion. So it is present on the anterior sloping surface of the petrous part of the temporal bone. So petrous part of the temporal bone on the apex. So it is actually present inside a fold of dura mater, which is called as the Meckel's cave. So you are able to see it is a dura mater which you are able to see, which will line the floor of the middle cranial fossa. which is endosteal layer. The other layer which is going to pass above is the meningeal layer. Now, the ganglion itself has its own meningeal covering, which is shown in the green color, because from the pons, when it is coming, it brings along with it a fold of or diverticulum of meninge, ballooning of the meninges along with it. So because of that, above the ganglion you have one meningeal layer, other meningeal layer, two meningeal layers. Below the ganglion you have one meningeal layer and floor lined by the endosteal layer. Okay, so two meningeal layers above and one meningeal, one endosteal layer below. So mainly it transmits the sensory branches. The three are the ophthalmic, maxillary and mandibular. The motor root separately it passes below the ganglion, enters the foramen ovale and then joins the trunk of the mandibular nerve. So mainly sensory ganglion, so made up of pseudo unipolar neurons, same like your dorsal root ganglion. Okay. So the convex margin mainly gives rise to these three branches. Pseudo unipolar neurons will have one peripheral process, central process, which mainly forms the trunk or the sensory root of the trigeminal nerve. So gives rise to ophthalmic, maxillary and mandibular from the convex anterior margin. Okay, the CSF extends up till the posterior part of the trigeminal ganglion. So below, as I told you, the motor root passes separately, which forms the relation, and also the apex of the petrous temporal. Okay, below the ganglion, that is the relations. Okay, then above the free margin of the tentorium, you are able to see the free margin forming the tentorial notch, which crosses above. Okay, now below the ganglion, you also have the greater petrosal nerve, which will be running below the ganglion, which is actually a parasympathetic branch of the facial nerve. Then medially you have the cavernous sinus and the internal carotid artery. Laterally you have the uncus of the temporal lobe, and of course the middle meningeal vessels. So these are the relations of the trigeminal ganglion. So sometimes it can be asked as a short note, or in trigeminal nerve, when you want to explain, you can also include this trigeminal ganglion. It is also called as Gazerian ganglion. Now, in case of intraceable pain, especially in the trigeminal neuralgia, so what happens is, if the pain cannot be traced, then you have to anesthetize this ganglion. So usually they inject an anesthetized material or alcohol into this Gazerian ganglion. Now coming to the middle meningeal artery, so it is a branch of the first part of the maxillary artery. It is enclosed by two roots of the auriculotemporal nerve. So the artery is actually present between the two roots of the auriculotemporal nerve, and it enters the skull via the foramen spinosum. So it is one of the largest meningeal branches supplying the meninges. So in fractures of the skull, it mainly produces epidural hematoma. So as I told you, it is enclosed by the two roots of the auriculotemporal nerve. So once it enters into the cranial cavity, it actually divides into an anterior trunk and posterior trunk, or you can call it as a frontal branch or a parietal branch. So you are able to see the frontal branch and the parietal branch. So frontal trunk, you are able to see the antero-inferior angle of the parietal bone, which is the sphenoidal angle. So your parietal bone will have antero-inferior, antero-superior, posterior-superior and posterior-inferior, 4 angles. So along the anterior-inferior angle, you can see the frontal trunk. Then it divides into many branches and supplies the dura up to the vertex of the skull. So this also corresponds with your lateral sulcus of your cerebrum, mainly your motor area, lateral sulcus. So as I told you, it corresponds to the motor cortex of the cerebrum. The parietal branch goes behind and supplies the dura up to the lambda of the skull. Okay, So you know the lambdoid suture, the meeting point of the lambdoid suture and the sagittal suture is the lambda. So up till the lambda it is responsible for supplying the meninges. So it also gives branches, ganglionic branches to the trigeminal ganglion, petrosal branches and superior tympanic and temporal branches. Okay, and it also gives an anastomotic branch to recurrent branch of the lacrimal artery, which is from the ophthalmic artery. So that is again a short description of the middle meningeal artery. So thank you very much for your patient listening. We will meet again in one more topic.